Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday's Live, and we are going to discuss a topic that concerns most English learners, and that is the beguiling and bedeviling phrasal verbs. We're going to look at that in the context of interviews and meetings. So a business context that I think could be very interesting. So I hope you all enjoy it. We've not talked about phrasal verbs in a very long time. Now, what's the aim of this live? It's twofold. The first is to learn 7 or 8, or maybe 9 or 10, if we add some of the equivalents, useful phrasal verbs. So this is for the student listening. And for the teacher out there, I'm going to offer an approach to phrasal verbs, which you might find interesting because I'm going to make small nuances to the approach to teaching phrasal verbs. So nuances are small changes, small adaptations. So they'll be slightly different, perhaps, than what you're used to, but on the whole, it's going to be theme-based, very practical. But I wanted to talk about methodology. Now, I have mentioned this slide, methodology, a few times and realized some of you might not know what this means. So, for the teachers or would-be teachers, would-be is would-be. Would-be means future teachers. For the teachers or would-be teachers listening today, methodology is a lot of the times where you develop your uniqueness, your creativity, your novelty, how you're different from the others. So the methodology today is quite interesting because we're approaching it within the theme of interviews/meetings, mainly interviews. So that is a common sort of a methodology or approach, but within that, I'm going to do a few interesting things that you may or may not have exposure to. They're nothing, difficult, but it's just nonetheless worth talking about. So I'm going to talk about the statements, and then I'm going to also use questions that the people being interviewed might ask. So the phrasal verbs in question form. I'm also going to look at online, offline equivalents because a lot of interviews today are done online. Zoom, Skype, Google Meet, or Classroom. So I'll look at online equivalents, which I think is an interesting addition. And then I'm going to add something on a few of the slides, common confusions for you to avoid. In other words, some of these phrasal verbs, unfortunately, have multiple meanings. And so we have to avoid being confused. All right, let's begin with phrasal verbs in the interview. And we're going to look at the first one now. If you have questions, write your question at the bottom of this screen. There's a question mark and a button. You press that button, you can ask your question, and I will get to it at the conclusion of this presentation. All right, the first verb is to set up. Now, we use it here. The interviewer could say, and I'd like you to repeat after me if you're in a position to do that, if you're in a quiet place. We set up the meeting for Wednesday at 9 a.m. I'm sorry, I said it differently from what I wrote. You can say I set up the meeting, or you can say I set the meeting up for Wednesday at 9 a.m. Why don't you try it? Both ways. All right, and now the question that I might have, when shall we set the meeting up for? Or you can delete for if it's a day. When shall we set the meeting up? For is, I think, most common to put at the end. For when, for what day, for what time. When shall we set the meeting up for? All right, now this is not to be confused with the exact same phrasal verb to set up, which means to build or construct something. So let's set the card table up, which means let's take it from storage and put the legs down and put it in the living room for when the guests arrive this evening. So that's to set something up. Interestingly, there's a noun, a setup, which is different. Now, these are verbs. Obviously, phrasal verbs are verbs, but the word set up can also be used as a noun, and that has yet another entirely different meaning. If you've been set up, it means they've invited you for dinner and then they arrest you. The police comes and arrests you. I've been set up. I thought I was going to dinner and I was arrested. So that's a setup. Be careful, it's a setup. It might be a setup. You might see these sorts of dialogues in movies, in detective movies or thrillers. All right, if you have any questions about that, you can write your question down and I will look at it at the end. All right, number 2, to come in. Or if you're online, to log on. So now we start to have this online, offline sort of bifurcative reality. Bifurcative is an old word that no one likes me to use, but I still use it. It's just a world divided into two. And we know that with the word by at the very beginning. All right, please come in to the interview room. So you'll be ushered in. Please come in is something you'll hear the interviewer tell you, or you can knock on the door of the interviewer's room and say, "Shall I come in?" And that is a common, very common phrasal verb that you will use. Now, the equivalent online is to log on. You're not coming in, you're logging on. So please log on at 10:20 in the morning or 10:20 a.m. You can say, "What time shall I log on?" Or "What time shall I log on at?" All right, so that's to log on. And now let's move to the third one. I'm moving quite quickly. I hope it's not too quick. To sit down. These are a little bit, you could say prosaic, mundane, a little bit perhaps obvious, but I wanted to go through all the possible phrasal verbs you might encounter, not all of them, but some of them. The most common ones you're probably going to encounter: please sit down. They're going to, once they invite you in, they'll say, "Please sit down," or this is not a phrasal verb, "Please have a seat." But those are both popular options in an interview or any sort of formal meeting where you're at the center of attention. Please have a seat. Please sit down here. Or you can say, "Shall I sit down here?" And you're asking to get permission. That's always very formal and polite. You don't just sit down, you're asked to sit somewhere because it's embarrassing to have to stand up and move. All right, on an online sort of interview, you have to turn on. So please turn on your camera and microphone, or you can have it a different way. Please turn your camera and microphone on. And so the microphone might be muted. If it's muted, you need to turn on your mic. Now, if you look here at the second question, "Shall I turn on my camera and mic?" That's the short form of microphone, M-I-C. Shall I turn on my mic? Is my mic on? So these are obviously things you have to attest to. I was in interviews all day today. I was on a committee of interviews, so we had problems with students not turning or not having their mic on. They were muted, or indeed not even being recognized on their computer. All right, so that's interesting. To cut in. Now, this is, I think, a very interesting one that you might not be as familiar with because you probably haven't heard it so much. The interviewer you're in the middle of talking, and today I cut in on 2 student interviews. I said, "Sorry to cut in," which means sorry to interrupt, sorry to cut in, but we are short of time and I need to ask you another question. So you can say, "Sorry to cut in," "Sorry to interrupt." All right. And this is not to be confused with cut in line. So it's also a phrasal verb, also uses cut in, but when someone cuts in line, there's a long line at the bank or the post office or anything where people are concerts waiting for your tickets, and somebody comes in the middle. They don't go to the end. They try to, you can see in the picture, they try to cut in the line. In Britain, they'd say to cut the queue or a queue jumper if you jump the queue. But to cut in line is something very different from interrupting someone. All right. If you have any questions, you can write them down. We are going to go to number 5 here. And now we have to cut someone off. So we had to cut in. Now we're cutting someone off. If you cut someone off, you stop them. It also is an overlap with cut in. You interrupt them. But if you cut them off, you actually stop them. Sorry, but we are going to have to cut you off. We are all out of time. That means stop. That's the end. We're cutting you off. So if you've been cut off, if you're talking on the phone and suddenly you lose your friend, you can't hear him anymore, it means you've been cut off. Our conversation got cut off, or you got cut off. This is what we'd tell our friends. Sorry, you got cut off. I didn't hear what you said at the end. So your friend would say, for example, how did the interview go? You might say it went well, but they cut me off at the end, so I'm not sure what to make of it. Here's another phrasal verb, to make of something. I'm not sure what to make of that or what to make of it. If you're not sure what to make of it, you're not sure how to interpret it. Was that positive? Was it negative? Was it just neutral? They're out of time and they want to stay on schedule, or stay on schedule if you want to know the British. So very interesting. Cut off is something that I cut 2 students off today. And I wasn't rude. Sometimes you can do it in a rude way. Other times very politely you remind them, sorry to cut you off, but we're out of time. Do you have any final remarks? That's something I used twice today. So these are very relevant for interviews, because I was on the other side of interviews. I was listening to the interviews. All right, so here we go to number 6. Which is, that's number 3. Let's go to number 6. To go on or to continue. So I'm going to combine a past phrasal verb with the new one. And this, I think, is a very interesting teaching technique for teachers out there. Use a previous example that you've just covered as a segue or a transition or a bridge to the new concept. So here we have it. Sorry to cut you off. Go on. Continue. Sorry to cut you off. You can continue now. Go on. So your question to the interviewer, would you like me to stop here or shall I go on? Would you like me to go on? Would you like me to proceed? Would you like me to continue? All 3 of these are fine. And what's interesting is that oftentimes people ask, are phrasal verbs formal, informal? Can we use them in formal contexts? And in these cases, these 7 cases that I'm discussing today are all acceptable in formal settings, like an interview. Shall I go on? Shall I proceed? Shall I continue? All have the same sort of effect. So yes, you can use these informal settings. Now, what you don't want to confuse this with, and you probably never will, is to go on in the past tense when the light went on. The light went on means it started working. So you don't want to confuse it. You probably won't. I think it's pretty obvious, but there is another phrasal verb to go on. It means to turn something on like a light. And finally, a very interesting variant of to go on is to go on and on. Now, if somebody goes on and on, they are talking a long time, and this is always negative. It's always negative. So to go on and on, to drone on and on, is never positive. It's a negative or a criticism. Let's do the final one, and then we're going to finish because I'm quite warm. All right, to figure out something. Here's a problem for you to read. We'd like you to figure out a solution to it. We'd like you to figure out a solution. So oftentimes in interviews for international companies, you have a problem that you have to figure out or solve. And to figure out means to solve. And they'll give you a problem that you have to solve. Now here is another phrasal verb equivalent. Here's a problem for you to read. we'd like you to come up with a solution or come up with a solution to it. So that means figure out a solution, solve the problem, and tell us. And then a very common expression in the US and other places is I'll figure it out. So if someone will say, do you have any questions? And you'll say, no, I'll figure it out. I'll sort it out. I will understand it on my own. And this is always, I think, very helpful phrase for some of you in certain circumstances. Now, let's just go to the conclusion. It's a very short conclusion. I'm going to just rehearse very quickly the 7 phrasal verbs plus their equivalents here. Number 1, we looked at to set up, to arrange a meeting. What time should we arrange a meeting? What time should we set up? To come in, obviously to enter, or to log on is to enter enter the virtual interview room, to sit down, have a seat, or to turn on your mic, to turn on your video and your mic. To cut in is to interrupt. To cut off is to stop someone from speaking. To go on is to continue talking, but to go on and on is to continue talking too much. And finally, to figure something out or to come up with something is to solve it in the form of a solution. All right. Now that was in all brevity, my old professor at Oxford used to say, in all brevity, those are 7 phrasal verbs that are handy, that are useful in an interview.